In this tutorial, I'm going to show how to do a very basic FK rig setup with controls and joints and some very basic skinning. Very basic skinning. The idea here is that you can use an FK joint setup or control setup on just about anything. It's not the most convenient setup and for a full character rig for sure, but for basic props or adding on, in this case, adding on this antenna here to this character, this is a really easy thing to do. The nice thing about this system is if you do it right, it's pretty much unbreakable. You can put it in any scene and an animator won't be able to bust it, and it's also intuitive for them to work with. So just much easier than if you're doing something very basic and don't know much about rigging, than just using straight out bones or trying to manipulate geometry. So again, this is just a very basic intro here. I'm going to blow through stuff a little quickly on some of this, but I just want to show how the control setup works. So here, I'm just going to, this character is already rigged and ready to go. I'm just going to be adding on this antenna, and we'll be doing the FK system with him. In case you're unfamiliar, FK stands for forward kinematics, and it's how a lot of body systems work. The other way, for example, arms tend to be FK, spines tend to be FK. IK setup is inverse kinematics and works the opposite way, which means you grab the child and can move it around and the parent stays still. Typically in an FK system, or not typically, in an FK system, when you move the parent, all the children below it move. In this case, the children are the eyelids and the eye of this character. Always follows the root control. So we're going to set up an FK system. So in here, you always want to be very clean when you're working with your models and your rigs. It's very easy to get things that cause compounding errors. So you want to be a little persnickety here with your naming and your organizing, maybe more so than you're used to. Here on my antenna, I'm going to go ahead and double click over here and call this antenna so I know what it is. I should actually be even more clear and say antenna mesh so I know what that is. It's important that you zero out all your transformations here. So I'm going to choose modify and freeze transformations just to make this the default settings. That way if I make any mistakes, it's easy to go back. And also when you're working with a rig, when you skin it, Maya remembers that as bind pose, and you always want to be able to get back to bind pose whenever you need to. If you make a mistake or you get an error, it's probably because you were connecting things or skinning things outside of bind pose. So when you know your mesh is zeroed out, you know that you're going to be in bind pose if you do it this way. We also want to make sure we don't have any history here. So here we have all the history for when this thing was made. You don't want that in a rig. That's bad news, and it's dirty, and it also makes your file bigger. So here I'm going to choose edit, delete by type, and delete history. That'll get rid of all that. I have a nice clean mesh. Now I'm going to go ahead and put this under my character node. I like when I'm working with my characters, if possible, to get all my controls, mesh, everything under one group. Just is nicer when you import or reference it into a file, and it's just nice and clean, especially once you get other things in there. If you're going to do duplicate characters, you don't have stuff all over the place here. In any character, or most characters you work with, you're going to find we tend to keep the mesh, in this case right here, separate from the actual control systems and the joints. So here, if I switch over to the wireframe mode in my layers, I make my joints visible. There's the joints. You'll see they are on two separate groupings. So here's all the joints and controls, and there's the mesh. Because of that, I'm going to take my antenna mesh, I'm going to drop it under my mesh group. It's not going to do anything here except for just keep everything nice and contained and controlled. I'm also going to take my mesh here, I'm going to put it on my Lou, which is the name of the character, the low res group. So I'm going to right click and choose add selected. That way if I need to hide my mesh, I can get rid of it quickly. You'll notice that the eye sticks around. That's because the eye is clickable and controllable. So you'll see that it has its own layer here. All right, so we got my mesh in place. I now need to go ahead and place my joints in here. Whenever you create joints, you always want to be in a side view or top view, any of the orthographic views here. You do not want to create joints in a perspective view. Joints very much like to be straight up and down, or as linear as they can be. They don't like to be all over the place. And the perspective view, that's what you're going to get. So you'll just get more consistent results this way. So I'm going to go over to my rigging menu and choose skeleton, create joints. In this case, my default joint settings will be what I want. So I'm just going to choose reset tool And in my window, I'm actually going to click on the grid to create my joints. Now in this case, I'm going to work off my root joint here. If I work off the root joint of the character, which is this guy right here, it'll ensure that whatever joints I put in there follow the root that's already part of the character. And we can add this on even though this character is already skinned. So I'm also going to, when I click my joints, and I want them to be in a nice perfect straight line, it'll just make my my antenna move more intuitively. It's going to line up better with my controls later on. So what I can do here, I don't need to get the grid perfect, but it'll be better if it's a little bit closer than it is now. I'm going to select my go to display grid and option box here. I'm just going to up my number of subdivisions to 5. I will up my I guess that didn't work. I'm not sure why that didn't work, to be honest. That should have given me another 5 subdivisions per unit here. Do I have to hit apply and close? It should have done it. Okay, well, I guess I'll just increase my number of subdivisions. Let's do a subdivision every 1 unit. There we go. So just a little bit tighter there. And to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click again on that first. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, if your joints are really big, much bigger than what I have here, if you go under display and animation and joint size, you can just change the visual size of the joints. You can make them really stupidly large, or you can make them very skinny. It's nice to at least have them skinny enough you can see what you're doing here. And I'm going to go ahead, just to make sure I don't accidentally click on this anything I don't mean to. I'm going to make sure that my geometry is in template mode, so I can see it but not click on it. And same thing with that eyeball. I don't want to accidentally click on the eyeball when I don't mean to. So let's turn that to the template mode there. So in here I'm going to click on this joint. If I click anywhere around that middle, it should connect directly to it. Oh, it's not connecting to it because my skeleton layer is referenced, is on reference mode, which actually means it's unclickable, which is generally exactly what you want, but not when you're actually working on it. So I'm going to click that off. And now I should be able to click on it. And when you make a joint, wherever you click next, it's going to click, and I can drag around in that area to get the joint where I want. What I want to do is actually get a base joint in here, right about where the antenna meets the head here. Now I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to actually undo that. And my first joint I set in, let's try this one more time. The first joint I set in, I'm going to click on the grid. I'm going to make my joints go up next to the bone, and I'm going to replace them later. This will be a relatively cheap way of getting a straight line of joints. You don't have to do this, but it's just nicer and cleaner. So again, I'm going to just hold an extra snap to grid. It's going to snap in about where they're going to be, not worrying that they're not perfect. As I work my way up the joint chain, the more I click, the more joints I get. So I want one at the base here. And then, actually maybe my first one I'll put right here. So we'll put one there. I'm going to get one here at each edge loop. Now, and then one here towards the top. And then you have to end your last one. Your last joint's going to be not usable. So this is the one that will actually be used, and this one just ends that joint. Now, the nice thing here is those joints are all in a nice straight line. They're perfectly straight, in fact, which will give me a nicer rig. You don't have to do this, but it generally gives you a nicer result. To move your joints, you can just translate them, and it will translate all the children below it. We never want to rotate joints, or we want to avoid rotating joints if we can. You'll see what that does is it puts a non-zero rotation. And it's a little bit more convenient or intuitive if you stick to zero-based rotations. Maya likes that. Plus, it'll always be easy to get back to bind pose if you know where the zero marks are. So I'm just going to line this up, that first joint here. And if you press the up arrow, you can actually the down arrow here, I can actually walk down the chain of joints really quickly and place each one. In this case, I'm just going to, actually use the up and down, lock it up and down, so I keep that nice vertical line here, all the way down. Again, kind of find the middle of each one of these edge loops. Now this isn't going to make the most perfect rotation bends here, because this really isn't quite enough geometry, to be honest. Switch over to world mode there. And don't worry about that last joint being all cockamamie. It doesn't matter. Again, that joint doesn't do anything except for end this joint, which does matter. Now you will notice that each one of these joints, the red x-axis is pointing down the joint. This is exactly what you want for a default setup, or for most setups, I should say. What that ensures is when I go to rotation, that X is a twisting motion along the joints. And that's how animators are used to rigs being for the most part, which is what the default setting was when we did create joint. So now we have our joint set up. This first one I'm not going to do anything with. I'm going to do something with all these next ones. Now I started to say, and I didn't finish my statement, is that if you want a good looking bend here for each one of these, actually let's hide that grid, that's getting a little bit obnoxious. Let's go back to every 5 units, and I guess that one didn't matter. There we go. If you want a nice bend, a nice curve with this, what you'd want to do instead is have probably 3 edge loops per joint. In fact, I'll just go ahead and do that in this case. It'll make a nicer looking bend. So I'm going to untemplate my geometry here, and I'll insert some edge loops. Again, however far you put these away from that joint is going to be about the resolution of your bend. So about like this. We'll put another one here. We already have 3 here, so I'm going to leave that as is, but I'm going to throw in another couple here so we can actually lock that off. We want to paint weights and keep this from smushing through the head. And then 3 up here for our top one. That'll create a nicer bend. Now you should notice, or take note of the fact, that in my mesh, I now have history again. So if you add in something like this, I need to go back in there and again edit, delete by type history. I'm still frozen transformation, so I'm fine in that regard, but we can't have any history in there. Cool. So we have our joints in, our mesh is ready and clean in the right place. Now the one thing I need to do before I jump in this and do anything else is I need to name these joints. So let's template my layer again. Now, why would you name each joint? It seems extraneous. When you're trying to skin things up later or add controls, if you don't have all your joints named, it can become very confusing very, very quickly. You just don't want that. So I'm going to call this, and plus when you get into a really big rig, this one's really a small rig, and even with a small rig, look at how much stuff is going on in there. In a really big rig, you're going to have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of nodes. Later on, you come back to it a month later and you don't know what these joints are and you're trying to fix things. It becomes really frustrating when you can't tell what's what, especially when painting weights. So I'm going to be good. I'll call this antenna. I didn't mean to do it like that. And I'll call this positioner. And then down the line, I'll call this antenna base. Antenna 1. If you add in a space, it'll automatically do a underscore. Antenna 2. I could say antenna 3, or I could say an antenna tip. I guess I'll do 3. Just want to be whatever naming convention you use, you just want to be consistent. There we go. So again, as I go through them, they're each named. I know which each one is. It'll be nice when I'm trying to actually line this up and do the final rigging. I'm going to go ahead and save right now just to make sure I don't lose anything. All right. So we're now ready. Joints are looking good. You'll notice that they automatically are placed correctly in here. I can find them by clicking on the base, right click and choose Reveal Selected. And you'll see that they threw them in right here. You notice that every other node on here is actually named carefully, with the exception of constraints and IKs are just default namings. The reason why this showed up in here and correctly is because we connected it to the root of the character. If we just put it in here freehand and didn't connect it to anything, which is a method as well, it would have shown up outside here. We would have had to drag and drop it into the hierarchy to get it into the group. All right, let's make our first control. Standard controls in Maya and in most 3D programs are going to be a NURBS curve. If I go to create NURBS primitive and circle, we get a NURBS curve. Now, we use NURBS curves because, they're actually easy to ignore. When you're animating, you don't want to be staring at some giant control that is distracting from the character itself. You want to be able to ignore the control and picture the silhouette of the character, or picture the expression or any sort of details in there. They also don't render, which is really nice. And they're intuitive. They're easy to look at, easy to see. You can see them turn and spin in space, except for, of course, the one direction I started to show you guys. They're just really easy to use and hard to bust. So, and they're light on the system, which is also important. Doesn't add much overhead into the actual system, which is good on a rig. You don't want to be dealing with anything more than what you need in slowing down your file. So I'm going to snap this over to my skeleton. Again, my mesh is still in template mode, so I shouldn't be able to jump to it. But my joints being visible, that's going to immediately want to snap to them. To snap to it, I'm just going to go to translate mode by pressing W, holding V for snap to point, and then middle mouse click drag anywhere in the scene, and you'll see it jumps to the first point it can find. Here it's very easy just to go to this spot here in the antenna, and I know it's right on that control, or right on that joint. You could technically offset it, but you'll get better results if your curves and your joints line up. I'm now going to scale this down to a more usable size. Again, I don't want it to be distracting from my character. I want it to be a nice even size. I don't want it to be lost in the geometry either. So if you're unsure, you can always turn yourself over to your reference mode and decide how big you want it. Again, think it like an animator. Think how easy it will be to ignore this thing. That's what you want. In fact, I'll even leave this mode on for now. I'm going to go ahead and name this now. I'm going to call this antenna control base. Now you'll notice I'm actually writing out the full name. This is generally good. You don't want to have any confusion when the animator's looking at it. When they click on it, they should know exactly what it does. So use the full words here. Your animators will appreciate it, and if you're the animator, you'll appreciate it. Just like everything else, I want to go ahead and freeze transformations on this. I already have some hotkeys for it. You can always make hotkeys by holding in Control and Shift, and then clicking on any button in here. It'll create a button for it automatically. So I can choose that freeze transformations again, and then delete history. You'll see these are right here because I use them all the time. Now with this name, I'm ready to go. As soon as I duplicate it, at least it'll keep most of the name, so that's good. I'm going to press Shift D, and then snap this one to the next point. Somehow I missed it. Oh, I got it. Looks like I'm getting it on the geometry there. Let's go over back to template modes. Make sure that doesn't happen. Not sure how that's happening actually. Shift D again and snap once more. Shift D again and then snap once more. So now I have 4 controls all lined up with their respective joints. These guys here, these smaller ones, I'm going to go ahead and shrink them up so they're more closely match the geometry, but again are still pretty easy to ignore. I could probably even go a little bit smaller on these. You just want to make sure that they're still easy for an animator to see and to grab. I also like the fact that the base here is a little bit bigger and easy to recognize as the base. Again, I'm not putting a control up here because it's the very tip, and that doesn't do anything except for end the previous joint. Okay, so now I just need to go through and name these. I'm going to name them the same thing as the joint that they connect to. It'll just make them easier to connect later on and keep everything in line. So this should be antenna control 1, antenna control 2, and then antenna control end, or you could say tip, whatever you want. Maybe I'll 3. All right, I said 3. So again, be consistent. It makes things easier when you're connecting or trying to troubleshoot. There we go. Now you notice that each one of these needs to have transformations frozen on it. So I'll select each one, freeze transformations, and we should be good to go. Cool. Now we have all our controls, all our joints, everything's named, and we're ready for the next step. Okay. We now, as you look over in the outliner, and if you don't see the outliner, by the way, just click on this button right here until it pops up. If you don't see the outliner, excuse me, I just said that. My brain is failing. You'll notice here in the outliner that your controls are lined up here. We actually need to get these to be parented together, so they're already a parented system. The joints here automatically are parented. That's pretty much what joints do. We want the controls here to mimic that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to my base. So here's my order, beginning with 1 and going up to 3. I'm going to middle mouse click and drag onto the control above it. This will automatically create a parenting setup. where this one here controls the one above it, just like your joints are going to be. You can hit the plus sign here to open this up. And now I'm going to take my antenna control 2 and drop it under antenna control 1. That creates another stair step. And then one more here. Oops, no big deal, I missed. I can just drag it where it's supposed to be. When you're done, you do want to test it and make sure that you didn't do anything weird. So I'm going to go up to each one. And you'll actually notice that the down arrow key trick works with this too. So I was able to position each one of these, and it respected the positioning of the control right above it, which means the hierarchy is right. When you're rigging, you want to make sure that you just keep undoing and going back to, after you test things out, going back to your default setup. So again, we're all zeroed out. Controls are looking good. They're underneath each other. We now need to get these into the rig. In this case, I know that I want them to follow this control right here, the root control of the character. So I'm just going to find out where that is in the system. So I'll click on that rig, on that control, right click and choose Reveal Selected. So the root control is right there underneath that super mover. So all I need to do is grab this control base, just the top one. I'm just going to drag it up here and put it on top of the root control. This should parent it underneath there, and now when I move my root control, you'll see they all move together. Now if you're wondering why the skin isn't moving with any of this, that's because the skin isn't connected to the joints yet. We'll have to skin that at the end. I usually wait till the end to do that, because once you do that, the joints don't like to be played with. And we're not done with them yet. So we are almost there. We have our mesh, we have our joints, we have our controls. Now the controls we need to connect to the joint. So when they move the control, it moves the joint as we would expect it to. To do this, we're going to use, instead of parenting, which technically would work, but it destroys the entire joint chain, the whole point of using this thing. So a better, what you actually want to use here, not even better, the right thing to use here is actually a constraint. In this case, we're going to use a parent constraint, which is going to do is essentially what a parenting does, but it will keep the mesh and the, it'll keep the controls and the joints separate. They won't be all overlapping each other. So for this one to work, we just want to go ahead and reset it back to defaults. The main function we want to make sure is clicked on, which is turned on during the default, is this maintain offset. This will keep everything looking just like we see it here and do a lot of the calculations and back to make it work as intuitively as we expect it to. The process here is pretty simple. I'm just going to click on the control first. In a constraint, you always click on the driver, and then you click on the driven. When you click on the driven, in this case the joint, I'm just going to press shift and just click anywhere in the middle of this joint. You don't need to click right on this ball. Anywhere in the middle will select this joint. Now all is going to highlight because they're all part of the chain, but it will only register those first two clicks. Everything else here is only looks like it's selected because it's part of that chain. So don't get nervous about that. I'm going to hit apply, and what we'll see is on this joint is we get these blue highlights here on the translates and rotates. The scales don't get them. They're actually not part of a parent constraint. You have to add that separately, which I'll show you guys how to do. And if you look on the control, if you've done it right, it should just look normal. Meaning, and the good thing about this, the important thing about this is that it's keyable. As soon as you see those blue things on there, it means it's not keyable, at least not in the normal sense. If I rotate this control now, we should see the joint rotates with it, and it does. That's good news. And if I zero that control out at any point, it should just pop back to that bind pose, or what will be the bind pose. Now, if you want to get scale as well, we can also do a scale constraint at the same time. So I can click on this, shift and click on the joint and hit apply, and now we'll see the full thing, including if I scale, will be affected. Will affect the joint. The better way to do this, though, in my mind, is to do all the parent constraints first. So we have this one window open and then work my way through. So again, just grab this control, shift and select the joint. Actually, can just hit apply. looks blue, looks good. I'm going to test it at the end. I'm going to hit G to repeat the last command, so I don't have to keep going back here. And then finally, this one. If I test each one, we should now see the joints follow the controls all the way down the chain. Looks great. And again, at any point I need to get things back, I can either undo, or actually at this point I could grab all these controls and just zero these guys out, and we should go right back to bind pose. Again, this is the setup, a good rig setup, nice and clean. All right, we're almost there. I did mention I would do the scale constraint, so really quick, I'll do the same thing there. Hit apply, working my way up the chain. Now it's also good to see what happens over here in the outliner. If I select any one of these joints, I'll just grab this middle guy here and reveal selected. What you should see, in fact, let's just go open this entire structure here. If you hold in Shift and you click on this plus sign, it opens the entire structure. And what we see here is for each antenna part, we see both a parent constraint and a scale constraint now in the system, or in the outliner, in the hierarchy. If at any point you make a mistake, you realize you did you messed up over here, it is totally fine to go in here and just delete these guys, or whichever two you need. In this case, I guess it would be this one, I think. There, we can see that one's gone now. If you need to, you can reset your rotates to 0. Sometimes those get messed up when you do a parent constraint. But other than that, you shouldn't have to touch them. You can just rebuild it. Actually, mine works, so I'm just going to leave it like that. But again, you can delete these just to redo it, or go back to a save version if you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable. All right, so we now have our rig, our joints ready to go, our controls named, and our joints constrained to each respective control. The only thing we have left to do is actually skin up the actual skin to the joints so that they actually move as we expect it to. So I'm going to go ahead and unreference this layer so I can actually select it. And to skin it, we're just going to use some really basic settings here. I'm going to go ahead and select my base joint. If I select down here, it will actually select the entire joint system, and if I skin, it'll reskin the entire character. I don't want that. In this case, all I want to do is just grab my base joint, grab my mesh here, and it will only skin up this mesh to this system of joints. To skin it, I'm going to choose Skin, Bind Skin, and the option box. I'm just going to reset this to defaults, and the only thing I'm going to change here is max influences. I'm going to drop down to 3. That'll make this a little bit easier to paint. It basically means that each vertex here can only be controlled by a max of 3 joints. It'll give me a nice smooth bend. If I want to paint it later, it's easy to do. Everything else here is just fine. I'm going to hit apply, and it should be skinned. So if I grab one of these joints and move it, we should now see the skin bending with the joints, and it is. You can test the whole thing. I'm just going to press undo after each test I do. That looks pretty good. I'd want to probably paint it. If you want to do a really quick kind of evening out of the skin, a really nice trick to use is to use a delta mush deformer, which will kind of smooth out the bends and make it feel a little bit more skin-like. So it's a nice trick. It's not perfect, but it's better than the base level one for the usually. Let's see. Yeah, pretty good. Now the last thing we want to do is set up our layers. So our outliner looks good. Everything's nice and tight there, all under one node. Let me go ahead and save in case I make a mistake. Over here in the outliner, in the layer editor, I have a lot of layers. Now probably more than this character, definitely more than this character needs. There's better ways to set up things, set up a character than with this many layers. But in this case, I did it like this because this is an intro level character, and it's just easier to set these things up and have that control through the layers. So what I want to do is make sure my eyeball is visible and selectable, because it is a control that I'm going to be having my animators click directly on. My mesh should always be not selectable, with the exception of that eyeball. So I don't want if the animators click on the mesh and then move it or move a vertex, it's going to break the rig. So that should be visible, but not selectable. Again, I'll test that. My super mover that's just my base level guy here for moving the character around in the scene. I'm just going to leave that as is. Controls, that should be the controls to the character. Now in this case, you'll notice that the controls I just added aren't connected to this. So I'm going to want to add those. But before I do, I'm just going to jump down to my skeleton layer and hide this thing. If I move the joints at this point directly, it's going to do some awful stuff to this rig. So I'm going to go ahead and reference those joints so that they're not selectable. That's the important thing. We want our animators to click on those. And I'm going to hide them so the animator can't even see them. One, that'll be more intuitive to look at, nicer to look at. And two, the animator will not be able to break the rig, or we'll have a much harder time at it anyway. So let's go back to the controls. You'll see if we hide them, they all disappear with the exception of that super mover, which is on that separate layer there. For the controls, at this point, I can just do a drag box. Grab them all like that because that's the only thing selectable in the scene. Right click and choose Add Selected Objects to this layer. They'll immediately disappear because that layer is hidden. And now I can bring it back whenever I see fit. At this point, the rig is done. This will work now. I can now have the animator click on any part of this. You'll notice the antenna follows nicely. I can grab multiple controls at once to bend that over and play with it. All my other controls work just fine. And I am ready to go. Now one last little bit of cleanup here. Over here in these layers, technically, let's zero all these out too. Oh, what did I do? I think I might have zeroed out my scales. Let's see. All right. So one of the things you can do to make your rig even more unbreakable is you can lock and hide attributes you don't want the animator to play with. Typically for joints, you just want animators to rotate them. You can allow them to translate, but you're making some risks in there. But it might be something that you want to let your animators do. I tend to, as an animator, prefer rigs that allow more control. So if I want to do something wacky, I can. Or if you maybe pass your rig off to an animator that's a lot more dramatic than you are, or more cartoony animator than you are, it's nice to give them that level of control. They can play with things as they see fit. As long as they're not going to break the rig, it's not a problem. So the visibility is one thing. I don't want my animator to accidentally hide a control and or be keying this thing constantly. That'd be pretty annoying. They have to keep undoing keys on there. So definitely the visibility we want to lock and hide. Scale is up to you. You can scale joints. It does work. That could be a fun thing to allow your animator to play with, or it might be something you don't want them to do. For this one, I'm going to go ahead and go down to the very basic rig just to give people a sense of it. Maybe I'll allow scale on this top one, even though it's a little funky, but just to show it. And then make sure visibility is hidden on all of these. The way you do it is you grab the control and you select the attribute you want to lock and or hide. In this case, I'm going to do all of these and holding control and do all my translates. Right click and choose. You can either just choose lock, which you'll see get this gray line, and what you'll see is I now can't scale it, I now can't translate it, and I can't hide it. Give me a warning. If you want to go a little farther than that, you can choose lock and hide selected. The downside to this is that there's no obvious way to get these back right away. I'll show you how, but if you're just rigging for the first time, this can be a little bit daunting suddenly to lose all your attributes, and locking works just fine. This is a lot cleaner looking though, so your animators will appreciate that, and it's what we typically expect. I'll go up the line here. I believe I can do two at once. Let's try it out. So I grab the visibility scale and translates, lock and hide. Let's see if it did both. I think if they have matching attributes, it'll let you do it. For this last one, let's go ahead and leave the scale there. And I'll just take out the translates and lock and hide. So that last one, it can't translate, but it can rotate and it can scale, just in case we want to play with that. So there we go. When you're done with a rig, it's really smart to go ahead and zero everything out, get it back to your bind pose. I believe with this eyelid, I leave it at a 25. 20. But it was bound at 0. This is just how I deliver it to the animator, just so they could give it some kind of neutral expression. And there we go. We have a finished rig with a finished FK added piece of geometry. And again, the same FK setup would work for any kind of system you want, and a lot of different props, things like that. You can even rig a whole character like this. It just would be a little bit clunky, but better than just clicking on mesh directly for sure, and also way better than clicking on joints directly. So really nice, easy system to create, very systematic once you get used to it, and it works in every situation, even if it's not always the best in every situation. But a lot of ones, excuse me, it will be exactly what you want. And for this antenna, this is, or a tail, something like that, this would be actually the setup that I'd want to see, even on a full professional rig. Now, last little bonus tip for you guys who are getting into this, you can also color code all your controls. So in this case, it is on this layer, this control layer. If you color the control layer, it'll adopt those colors. So here, if I were to color this, say, green, you'll see they all turn green as well. Remember that you do want them to be easy to ignore. So actually the green's not bad, but also be easy enough to see. So actually that still functions, although it starts to kind of feel like part of the design. So be a little cautious there. If you want to set up individual colors, regardless of the layer it's on, you can always click on these guys. I'll do them all at once. Press Control A for the attribute editor. And then under the drawing, let's see here, it'll be actually under Object Display and Drawing Overrides. You can click on these, and in here you can choose a different color, any color it allows you to click on here. So I'll just do something like this. Okay, I only got the top one. Same process though for all these. You can just click on each one, and okay, that's a little annoying. I'll do a darker one for this. To show the tip, I don't know. But obviously you can see the idea here and get full control over each antenna and the color. Now it's worth it to say that might seem excessive and unnecessary, but again, it's really nice for your animator to have separated components here. So when you're looking at your character from a distance, it's very easy to see, oh, that's the antenna controls, that's the alley controls, this is the root control. So actually having individual control over each one of these can actually make everything easier for the animator. Looks like I have the root control locked out, but you get the idea here. And at this point, we have a system that's ready to go, easy to see, easy to use, very intuitive, nice FK rig system. So good luck. Hopefully that works for you. And even though it took a good 37 minutes, if I wasn't talking through it and just doing it, it'd probably take me about 5 to 10 minutes tops. You can do this really quickly once you get used to it. All right, good luck.